The room was cold, sterile, and silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. The nurse stood in the center, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her scrubs. Around her, the hospital board members sat at a long table, their faces hard and unreadable. The head of the board, a stern man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that echoed like a judge's gavel. "You are hereby terminated for violating hospital protocols," he said, his tone final. The nurse's heart sank. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Her mind raced back to the incident that had brought her here, the elderly woman in dirty clothes, her humble demeanor, and the way she had been turned away by the receptionist. The nurse had only done what she thought was right. How could helping someone in need be a crime? "This is a mistake," she finally managed to say, her voice shaking. "I was just trying to help her." The board members exchanged glances, but no one spoke in her defense. The head of the board leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You interfered with hospital procedures. You treated a patient without proper authorization. These actions cannot be overlooked." The nurse felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to scream, to tell them about the woman's frail hands, her grateful smile, and the way she had whispered, "Thank you, dear," before leaving. But she knew it wouldn't matter. The decision had already been made. As she walked out of the room, her ID badge was taken from her, and she was escorted out of the building. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, and she stood on the sidewalk, feeling lost and alone. The hospital had been her life for years, and now it was gone, all because of one act of kindness. But as she replayed the events in her mind, something didn't add up. Why had the hospital reacted so harshly? Why had the elderly woman been turned away in the first place? And why had she disappeared without a trace after the nurse treated her? The nurse clenched her fists, determination replacing her despair. She didn't know what was going on, but she was going to find out. The nurse spent the next few days trying to make sense of what had happened. She couldn't shake the image of the elderly woman from her mind, the way she had looked at her with gratitude, the way her hands had trembled as she held the cup of water the nurse had given her. Who was she? And why had the hospital been so determined to turn her away? The nurse decided to start her search at the hospital. She knew she couldn't go inside, but she waited outside the building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman or someone who might know her. She asked the security guards, the janitors, and even the patients who came and went, but no one had seen the elderly woman. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Frustrated but determined, the nurse expanded her search to the surrounding neighborhoods. She visited shelters, soup kitchens, and community centers, showing people a sketch she had drawn of the woman. Most people shook their heads, but one man at a homeless shelter paused and squinted at the drawing. "I think I've seen her," he said slowly. "She was here a few days ago, but she didn't stay long." She kept muttering something about the facility. "The facility," the nurse repeated, her heart racing. "What facility?" The man shrugged. "I don't know." She didn't say much. But she left in a hurry, like she was scared of something. The nurse thanked him and left, her mind buzzing with questions. What facility was the woman talking about? And why had she been scared? As she walked through the city, she noticed a pattern. The elderly woman had been seen near the outskirts of town, close to an area that was fenced off and marked with "No Trespassing" signs. The locals called it the restricted zone, and rumors about it had circulated for years. Some said it was a government research facility. Others claimed it was a secret lab where dangerous experiments were conducted. The nurse's curiosity grew. She knew it was risky, but she had to find out more. That night, she packed a small bag with a flashlight, a notebook, and a camera. She waited until the streets were empty, then made her way to the restricted zone. The fence was tall and topped with barbed wire, but she found a spot where the wire had been cut. She slipped through and crept toward the buildings in the distance. The air was thick with tension, and every sound made her jump. As she approached the nearest building, she noticed a sign on the door, "Authorized personnel only." She hesitated, then tried the handle. To her surprise, it was unlocked. Inside, the building was dark and eerily quiet. She turned on her flashlight and scanned the room. It was filled with filing cabinets, computers, and strange equipment she didn't recognize. She opened one of the cabinets and pulled out a folder. The label on the folder made her blood run cold, "Project Humility." She flipped through the documents, her hands trembling. The files contained detailed reports on human behavior, morality, and kindness. There were photos of people, ordinary people, being observed in various situations. And then she saw it, a photo of the elderly woman. The caption beneath the photo read, "Subject 47, Key to Phase 3. The nurse's mind raced. What was this project? And why was the elderly woman a part of it? Before she could read further, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She froze, her heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She quickly stuffed the folder into her bag and turned off her flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept across the room. The nurse held her breath, praying she wouldn't be seen. The beam of light swept across the room, inches from where the nurse was hiding behind a filing cabinet. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. The footsteps paused, and she heard a low murmur of voices. "I thought I heard something," a man's voice said. "Probably just the wind," another voice replied. "This place gives me the creeps." The nurse held her breath as the light lingered for a moment longer, then moved away. The footsteps retreated, and the door clicked shut. She waited a few seconds before letting out a shaky breath and turning her flashlight back on. She knew she didn't have much time. Whoever was in the building would likely come back, and she needed to get out before they found her. But she couldn't leave without more answers. She opened the folder she had taken from the cabinet and flipped through the documents. The more she read, the more her unease grew. Project Humility was a government-funded experiment designed to test human morality and kindness. People were placed in difficult situations, and their reactions were observed and recorded. The elderly woman, Subject 47, had been a key part of the experiment. According to the files, she was a former scientist who had been forced to participate after she tried to expose the project. Her role was to act as a test subject, to see how others would respond to someone in need. The nurse's hands trembled as she read the details. The experiment was unethical, invasive, and downright cruel. And now, she realized, she had become a part of it. Her act of kindness had been observed, recorded, and used as data. Anger surged through her, but she pushed it aside. She needed to focus. She took photos of the documents with her camera, making sure to capture every detail. If she could get this evidence to the public, she could expose the project and bring it to an end. As she was putting the folder back, she noticed a small USB drive tucked inside. She grabbed it and slipped it into her pocket, hoping it contained more information. Just as she was about to leave, she heard the door creak open again. She turned off her flashlight and ducked behind the cabinet, her pulse racing. This time, the footsteps were faster, more deliberate. The beam of light swept across the room, and she heard a voice say, "Check the cabinets. She might still be here." The nurse knew she had to act fast. She waited until the light moved away, then bolted for the door. "There she is," someone shouted. She didn't look back. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty building. The voices behind her grew louder, and she could hear the sound of running feet. She turned a corner and saw an exit sign glowing in the darkness. She pushed through the door and burst outside, the cool night air hitting her face. She didn't stop running until she reached the fence, where she squeezed through the gap and disappeared into the shadows. Back in her apartment, she locked the door and leaned against it, her chest heaving. She pulled the USB drive from her pocket and stared at it, her mind racing. What was on it? And how could she use it to expose the truth? The nurse sat at her small kitchen table, the USB drive in front of her. Her laptop was open, and she hesitated for a moment before plugging in the drive. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew it could change everything. The drive contained dozens of files, videos, documents, and audio recordings. She clicked on the first video, and her stomach churned as she watched. The footage showed the elderly woman, subject 47, sitting in a dimly lit room, her hands clasped in her lap. A voice off camera asked her questions, probing her about her past, her beliefs, and her feelings about the experiment. The woman's answers were calm but laced with bitterness. "I never wanted to be a part of this," she said. "But they gave me no choice. If I refused, they threatened to harm my family." The nurse's heart ached as she listened. The woman had been forced into this nightmare, just like so many others. She clicked on another file, this one a document detailing the objectives of Project Humility. The goal of the project was to study human behavior in extreme situations, particularly acts of kindness and selflessness. The researchers wanted to understand what motivated people to help others, even at great personal cost. But the methods they used were horrifying: manipulation, deception, and outright cruelty. The nurse scrolled through the files, her anger growing with each page. There were reports on other subjects, ordinary people who had been unknowingly drawn into the experiment. Some had lost their jobs, their homes, even their families because of the project's interference. And then she found it, a file with her name on it. She opened it and saw photos of herself, taken without her knowledge. There were notes about her actions, her personality, and her potential for kindness. The file concluded with a chilling statement: subject demonstrates high levels of empathy and self-sacrifice. Ideal candidate for further observation. The nurse slammed her laptop shut, her hands shaking. She felt violated, angry, and determined all at once. She couldn't let this continue. She had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. But how? She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone who could get the story out to the public. She thought of the journalist she had met a few years ago at a charity event. He had been passionate about uncovering corruption and injustice. If anyone could help her, it was him. She found his contact information and sent him a message, explaining what she had discovered and asking to meet. To her relief, he responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet her the next day at a quiet cafe on the other side of town. The nurse spent the rest of the night preparing. She printed out the most damning documents, copied the files onto another drive, and wrote down everything she remembered about the facility and the people involved. She knew the risks, but she also knew she couldn't stay silent. The next morning, she arrived at the cafe early and chose a table in the corner, away from the windows. She kept her bag close, the evidence inside feeling like a ticking time bomb. The journalist arrived a few minutes later, his expression serious but curious. He listened intently as she explained everything, his eyes widening as she showed him the documents and played snippets of the recordings. "This is huge," he said when she finished. "If we can verify this, it could bring down the entire project." "But we have to be careful," the nurse said. "They're watching me. They'll do anything to keep this quiet." The journalist nodded. "I'll start digging into this right away. But you need to lay low. If they find out you're talking to me, you could be in serious danger." The nurse agreed, but as she left the cafe, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder several times, but the street was empty. Or so she thought. The nurse walked quickly down the street, her bag clutched tightly to her side. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. She turned a corner and ducked into a small bookstore, pretending to browse the shelves while keeping an eye on the door. A few minutes passed, and no one suspicious entered. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and decided it was safe to leave. But as she stepped back onto the sidewalk, she saw him, a man in a dark coat, standing across the street, watching her. Their eyes met for a split second before he turned and walked away. Her heart raced. She didn't know who he was, but she couldn't take any chances. She hailed a taxi and gave the driver an address a few blocks from her apartment. She would walk the rest of the way, taking a roundabout route to make sure she wasn't followed. When she finally got home, she locked the door and leaned against it, her legs trembling. She knew she couldn't stay here. If they had found her once, they could find her again. She packed a small bag with essentials, clothes, money, and the evidence she had gathered. She left a note for her landlord, saying she would be away for a while, and slipped out the back door. The journalist had given her the address of a safe house, a small apartment owned by a friend who was out of town. She made her way there, constantly checking over her shoulder. By the time she arrived, it was dark, and the streets were quiet. She let herself in and collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but unable to relax. Her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. She needed to stay hidden, but she also needed to keep working with the journalist to expose the truth. The next morning, she received a message from him. "Meet me at the park at noon. Be careful." She arrived early, choosing a bench near a busy playground where they could blend in with the crowd. The journalist arrived a few minutes later, carrying a newspaper under his arm. He sat down beside her and spoke in a low voice. "I've started looking into Project Humility," he said. "It's bigger than we thought. There are connections to high-level officials, and the funding is coming from multiple sources. If we're going to expose this, we need solid proof, something undeniable." The nurse nodded. "I have more evidence. Videos, documents, even names of people involved. But we need to move fast. They're already watching me." The journalist handed her a burner phone. "Use this to contact me. Don't use your regular phone, it's probably being tracked. And don't go back to your apartment. It's not safe." They spent the next hour going over the evidence and planning their next steps. The journalist would start writing the story while the nurse continued to gather information. They agreed to meet again in 2 days, but only if it was absolutely necessary. As they were about to leave, the nurse noticed the man in the dark coat again, standing near the playground. Her stomach dropped. "We need to go," she whispered. "Now." The journalist followed her gaze and immediately understood. They stood up and walked in opposite directions, blending into the crowd. The nurse kept her head down, her heart pounding as she made her way to the edge of the park. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the man following her. She quickened her pace, weaving through the crowd, but he stayed close. She turned down a narrow alley, hoping to lose him, but it was a dead end. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped. She turned to face the man, her back pressed against the wall. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. The man didn't answer. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, she thought he was going to pull out a weapon. But instead, he handed her a small envelope. "You're in over your head," he said in a low voice. "Take this and get out of the city. If you stay, you'll regret it." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The nurse opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a train ticket and a note that read, "You're not the only one who wants to stop this." The nurse stared at the train ticket in her hand, her mind racing. Who was the man in the dark coat? Was he a friend or another enemy? The note suggested he wanted to help, but she couldn't be sure. She decided not to take any chances. Instead of using the ticket, she found a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city and checked in under a fake name. The room was dimly lit and smelled of stale cigarettes, but it was a place to hide while she figured out her next move. That night, she plugged the USB drive into her laptop and began going through the files again, looking for anything she might have missed. As she scrolled through the documents, she found a folder labeled Subject 47, Personal Notes. Her pulse quickened as she opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, scans of journal entries written by the elderly woman herself. The nurse began to read, and with each word, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. The woman's name was Clara, and she had been a brilliant scientist specializing in human behavior and ethics. Years ago, she had been recruited to work on Project Humility, believing it was a legitimate study on kindness and morality. But as the project progressed, she realized the truth: it was a cruel experiment designed to manipulate and control people. Clara had tried to expose the project, but her superiors had threatened her and her family. They forced her to become a test subject, using her as bait to observe how others would react to someone in need. The nurse's act of kindness had been one of many tests, but it had also been a turning point. In her final journal entry, Clara wrote, "I can't do this anymore. I've seen too much, and I can't stay silent. If anyone finds this, know that Project Humility is a lie. It's not about understanding kindness, it's about destroying it. Please, stop them before it's too late." The nurse's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. Clara had been a victim, just like her, but she had also been a fighter. She had risked everything to expose the truth, and now it was up to the nurse to finish what she had started. The next morning, the nurse contacted the journalist using the burner phone. She told him about Clara's notes and the new evidence she had found. "This changes everything," he said. "If we can connect Clara's story to the project, it will make the story even more powerful. But we need to be careful. If they find out we have this, they'll come after us with everything they've got." The nurse agreed. "I'll keep digging. There has to be more, something that ties it all together." Over the next few days, she worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence. She found more files on Clara, including photos and videos of her being questioned and observed. She also discovered a list of names, people who had been involved in the project, from scientists to government officials. But the most shocking discovery came when she found a video labeled Final Test. She clicked on it, and her heart sank as she watched. The footage showed Clara sitting in a room, looking frail and exhausted. A man in a lab coat stood in front of her, holding a syringe. "This is the final phase," the man said. "If you cooperate, we'll let you go. If not, well, you know what happens." Clara's face was filled with defiance. "I won't help you," she said. "You can't make me." The man sighed and injected her with the syringe. Clara's body went rigid, and then she slumped forward, unconscious. The nurse felt sick to her stomach. What had they done to her? And where was she now? She knew she had to find Clara. If she was still alive, she might be the key to exposing the project once and for all. The nurse spent the next few days preparing to release the evidence. She knew it was risky, but she also knew it was the only way to stop Project Humility. She met with the journalist in a secluded park, far from prying eyes, to finalize their plan. "We need to leak the story to multiple outlets at once," the journalist said. "If we only send it to one, they might bury it. But if it's everywhere, they won't be able to stop it." The nurse nodded. "I've organized all the evidence, Clara's notes, the videos, the documents. It's all here." She handed him a USB drive. "But once we do this, there's no turning back." The journalist took the drive and gave her a determined look. "We're doing the right thing. People need to know the truth." They spent hours drafting a press release and compiling the evidence into a format that would be easy for reporters to understand. By the time they were done, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the park. "We'll send it out tomorrow morning," the journalist said. "That gives us one more night to make sure everything's ready." The nurse agreed, but as she walked back to the motel, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder several times, but the streets were empty. Still, the sense of unease stayed with her. That night, she barely slept. She lay on the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if the story didn't get out? What if they were caught before they could expose the truth? The next morning, she met the journalist at a small cafe. They sat at a corner table, their laptops open, ready to send the evidence to every major news outlet they could think of. "Ready?" the journalist asked. The nurse took a deep breath. "Ready." They hit send at the same time, and within minutes, the story began to spread. Reporters started calling the journalist, asking for more information. Social media exploded with posts about Project Humility, and the hashtag #ExposeHumility began trending. The nurse watched in awe as the story gained traction. People were outraged, demanding answers and accountability. She felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had done it. But their victory was short-lived. As they were packing up their laptops, the nurse's burner phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have done that." Her blood ran cold. She showed the message to the journalist, who immediately stood up. "We need to go. Now." They left the cafe and started walking quickly down the street, but it wasn't long before they realized they were being followed. A black car pulled up beside them, and two men in suits got out. "Get in the car," one of them said, his voice cold and commanding. The nurse and the journalist exchanged a glance, then bolted in opposite directions. The nurse ran down an alley, her heart pounding as she heard footsteps behind her. She turned a corner and ducked behind a dumpster, holding her breath as the men ran past. When the coast was clear, she slipped out of the alley and made her way to a nearby bus station. She bought a ticket to the next town over, hoping to disappear for a while. As the bus pulled away, she looked out the window and saw the black car driving slowly down the street, searching for her. She slumped in her seat, trying to calm her racing heart. They had exposed the truth, but the fight wasn't over. The nurse arrived in the next town late that evening, exhausted and on edge. She found a small, quiet inn and checked in under another fake name. The room was simple but clean, and she locked the door behind her, finally allowing herself to breathe. She turned on the TV, flipping through the channels until she found a news station. The story of Project Humility was everywhere. Reporters were discussing the leaked evidence, interviewing experts, and demanding answers from government officials. "This is one of the most shocking revelations in recent history," one anchor said. "A secret government project designed to manipulate human behavior, using unsuspecting citizens as test subjects. The public is outraged, and calls for accountability are growing louder by the minute." The nurse felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The truth was out, but she knew the people behind Project Humility wouldn't go down without a fight. She checked her burner phone and saw a message from the journalist, "Stay hidden. They're looking for us." She replied quickly, "I'm safe for now." "What's happening there?" His response came a few minutes later, "The story's blowing up. Officials are denying everything, but the evidence is too strong. Protests are starting outside government buildings. We did it, but we're not out of the woods yet." The nurse knew he was right. She had seen the men in the black car, and she had no doubt they would stop at nothing to silence her. She needed to stay hidden until the public outcry made it too dangerous for them to act. Over the next few days, she watched the news obsessively, following every development. The story dominated the headlines, and more evidence began to surface as whistleblowers came forward. People who had worked on Project Humility, scientists, administrators, even security guards, shared their stories, adding to the mountain of proof against the project. But the nurse's relief was tempered by worry. Clara's fate was still unknown, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the elderly woman was the key to bringing the whole operation down. She decided to reach out to the journalist again. "We need to find Clara," she wrote. "If she's still alive, she could be the final piece of the puzzle." The journalist agreed. "I'll start looking into it. But you need to stay hidden. If they find you, it's over." The nurse knew he was right, but staying hidden was harder than she thought. The days dragged on, and the isolation began to wear on her. She missed her old life, her job, her friends, the sense of normalcy she had taken for granted. One evening, as she was watching the news, a breaking story caught her attention. Breaking news: a high-ranking government official has just resigned amid the growing scandal surrounding Project Humility. In a statement, the official denied any personal involvement but acknowledged that serious mistakes were made. Meanwhile, protests continue to grow, with demands for a full investiga. The nurse sat in her motel room, staring at the journalist's message. Clara was alive, but she was being held in a secure facility. Rescuing her would be dangerous, but it was the only way to ensure the truth about Project Humility could never be buried again. The journalist had sent her the location of the facility and a rough plan. They would need to move quickly and carefully, as the people behind the project were desperate to cover their tracks. The nurse packed a small bag with essentials and left the motel under the cover of darkness. She met the journalist near the facility, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. They crouched behind a row of bushes, watching as guards patrolled the perimeter. "We'll have to move fast," the journalist whispered. "I've disabled the security cameras, but we only have a small window before they notice." The nurse nodded, her heart pounding. She followed him as he slipped through a gap in the fence and made his way to a side door. He picked the lock with practiced ease, and they slipped inside. The facility was eerily quiet, the halls lit by dim fluorescent lights. They moved quickly, following the journalist's map to the room where Clara was being held. When they reached the door, the nurse's hands trembled as she entered the code the journalist had provided. The door clicked open, and they stepped inside. Clara was sitting on a cot, her face pale and drawn. She looked up in surprise as they entered, her eyes widening when she saw the nurse. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The nurse rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "We're getting you out of here," she said. "But we need to hurry. Thession and accountability for those responsible." The nurse felt a surge of hope. The tide was turning, and the people behind Project Humility were starting to feel the pressure. But she knew it wasn't over yet. That night, she received another message from the journalist: "I think I've found Clara. She's in a secure facility, but I'm working on a way to get her out. Stay safe, we're close." The nurse's heart raced. If they could rescue Clara, it would be the final blow to Project Humility. But she also knew it would be the most dangerous part of their plan. The nurse sat in her motel room, staring at the journalist's message. Clara was alive, but she was being held in a secure facility. Rescuing her would be dangerous, but it was the only way to ensure the truth about Project Humility could never be buried again. The journalist had sent her the location of the facility and a rough plan. They would need to move quickly and carefully, as the people behind the project were desperate to cover their tracks. The nurse packed a small bag with essentials and left the motel under the cover of darkness. She met the journalist near the facility, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. They crouched behind a row of bushes, watching as guards patrolled the perimeter. "We'll have to move fast," the journalist whispered. "I've disabled the security cameras, but we only have a small window before they notice." The nurse nodded, her heart pounding. She followed him as he slipped through a gap in the fence and made his way to a side door. He picked the lock with practiced ease, and they slipped inside. The facility was eerily quiet, the halls lit by dim fluorescent lights. They moved quickly, following the journalist's map to the room where Clara was being held. When they reached the door, the nurse's hands trembled as she entered the code the journalist had provided. The door clicked open, and they stepped inside. Clara was sitting on a cot, her face pale and drawn. She looked up in surprise as they entered, her eyes widening when she saw the nurse. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The nurse rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "We're getting you out of here," she said. "But we need to hurry." They moved quickly through the halls, avoiding the guards as much as possible. But as they reached the exit, they were confronted by two men in suits, the same men who had been chasing the nurse. "You're not going anywhere," one of them said, pulling out a gun. The nurse froze, her mind racing. But before the men could act, Clara stepped forward. "It's over," she said, her voice steady despite her frail appearance. "The truth is out, and you can't stop it. If you hurt us, it will only make things worse for you." The men hesitated, glancing at each other. The journalist took advantage of the moment, pulling out his phone and hitting record. "Go ahead," he said. "Make your move. The whole world is watching." The men lowered their weapons, their faces pale. They knew they had lost. The nurse, Clara, and the journalist slipped past them and out into the night. They didn't stop running until they were far from the facility, hidden in the safety of the shadows. The next morning, the journalist released the footage of their escape, along with Clara's story. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Government officials were forced to admit the truth, and Project Humility was shut down for good. The nurse and Clara became symbols of courage and kindness, their story inspiring people around the world. The nurse returned to her work, more determined than ever to help others, while Clara spent her remaining years advocating for ethical science and human rights. As for the journalist, his career skyrocketed, but he never forgot the risks they had taken to expose the truth. The life lesson. The story ends with the nurse reflecting on everything that had happened. She realized that kindness was not a weakness but a strength, a force powerful enough to bring down even the most corrupt systems. In a world that often rewards selfishness, true courage lies in being kind. And no matter how dark things may seem, one act of compassion can change everything.